Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're taking a chronological journey through the life of a single, unassuming yet literally world-changing building nestled up in the English Lake District. We're talking about Dove Cottage. We're going to trace exactly how a modest stone structure evolved to shape the course of literature forever. Okay, let's dive into this.
Plain living, but high thinking. This simple phrase right here perfectly defines the incredible 8-year stretch that the poet William Wordsworth and his sister Dorothy spent at the cottage from December 1799 to May 1808. And as we go through this, I really want you to keep that contrast in mind. We're looking at immense, expansive literary masterpieces that were born inside a remarkably humble, constrained physical space.
Chapter 1. The Dove and Olive Inn. Let's look at the earliest days of the building before it became a literary sanctuary.
Let's move to and see how this builds. The cottage actually had a completely different life before the poets arrived. Starting in the early 17th century, it was likely purpose-built as a public house beside the main road connecting Ambleside to Keswick. By 1617, it's officially on the books as the Dove and Olive Inn, and it operated as a pub right up until 1793. That's just a few years before the Wordsworths showed up, followed by the writer Thomas de Quincey, and eventually, its modern preservation.
To really get a feel for this space, you got to imagine stepping into an early 17th century Lakeland pub. It was built tough, local stone, lime-washed walls, a sturdy slate roof. The ground floor, which was designed for drinking patrons, had these robust oak panels and incredibly cold, dark slate floors. Interestingly, in the 1790s, just before the pub closed its doors, the fireplaces were updated. They swapped out the traditional smoky Lakeland peat for coal, modernizing it just a bit right before its most famous residents moved in. Chapter 2. Plain Living, High Thinking. Enter the Wordsworths.
So, in late 1799, William Wordsworth, who already knew the Lake District from childhood, goes on a walking tour with his buddy, the poet Samuel Taylor Coleridge. He finds the former pub sitting empty. By December 20th, he and Dorothy move in. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the number, £5. That was their incredibly low annual rent, paid to a local guy named John Benson. But, as you might guess, that cheap rent came with major trade-offs. Absolutely no running water inside, and the toilet? Way out in the garden. They were quite literally living the plain living part of their philosophy. Let's map out the inside to really grasp the cramped, rustic scale we're talking about here. 8 tiny rooms in total. Downstairs, you've got the house place, basically a kitchen parlor with a cooking range and a window seat where they ate. Next to that is Dorothy's small bedroom, a separate kitchen for heavy chores, and a buttery for food storage. Upstairs is William's study overlooking the meadows, plus 3 more bedrooms. And it was freezing! In 1800, it got so cold they actually lined the walls of the small bedroom with newspapers, just trying to insulate the place. Yet out of that freezing, unplumbed, tiny upstairs study came a seismic shift in English literature. William wrote some of his absolute best work right here. We're talking Ode to Duty, My Heart Leaps Up, the legendary I Wandered Lonely as a Cloud, and huge chunks of his massive autobiographical epic, The Prelude. It's almost hard to wrap your head around the contrast between that tiny room and the massive cultural impact of the poetry produced inside it. Chapter 3. A Hub for Romantics. This is where the house gets incredibly busy. You see, Dove Cottage was not just a quiet retreat for 2 siblings working in perfect isolation, it rapidly became a vibrant intellectual hub. And this brilliantly illustrates the creative dynamic at play inside the house. Dorothy kept this amazing, intimate diary called the Grassmere Journal. In 1802, she writes this vivid entry about seeing daffodils near Ullswater. Well, William read her daily entries, he drew direct inspiration from them, and 2 years later that specific journal entry blossomed into his famous 1804 poem, I Wandered Lonely as a Cloud. They were literally feeding off each other's creativity.
Then the place just gets packed to the rafters. In 1802, some old family debts owed to William's late father by the 1st Earl of Lonsdale were finally paid out with interest. Suddenly, William is financially stable. He marries his childhood friend, Mary. So picture this. Into these 8 tiny rooms, you squeeze William, Mary, his sister Dorothy, Mary's sister Sarah, 3 toddlers born in quick succession, John, Dora, and Thomas, and their neighbor Molly Fisher, who they hired as a maid. Imagine all those people in that tiny space. Absolute chaos.
And as if the family wasn't enough, the cottage became ground zero for the Romantic movement. They had a constant rotation of famous guests. Samuel Taylor Coleridge, Robert Southey,
Walter Scott, the scientist Humphrey Davy, Charles and Mary Lamb. The list goes on. They'd all cram into the parlors or hang out in the carefully curated wild garden out back, which William and Dorothy affectionately called their little nook of mountain ground.
Chapter 4. The Opium Eater Era. The cottage takes a fascinating, darker twist.
So by 1808, the Wordsworths simply outgrow the place. They pack up in May and move to larger lodgings. The following year, 1809, their friend Thomas de Quincey takes over the lease. And de Quincey's vibe was entirely different from Wordsworth's wholesome nature worship. De Quincey is famous for writing Confessions of an English Opium Eater, which detailed his intense addiction. In the book, he literally describes himself relaxing at the cottage with a quart of laudanum.
For those who might not know, laudanum is a highly potent opium tincture. So the crucial point is how de Quincey's addiction-fueled era actually physically altered the space. He totally reworked the interior just to store his massive mountain of books. And, much to the Wordsworths' horror, he ruined their beloved wild garden. De Quincey married a local farmer's daughter and lived there until 1835, when mounting debts finally forced him to leave for good.
Chapter 5. Preserving a Poetic Legacy. Bringing the story into the modern era.
Let's trace the final evolution of the building. After de Quincey leaves, you get a succession of regular local tenants. By the 1860s, it's just a standard lodging house. But in the late 1880s, an early biographer of Dorothy Wordsworth named Edmund Lee buys it. Recognizing its history, a group led by Reverend Stopford Brooke forms the Wordsworth Trust. They buy the cottage from Lee in 1890 for £650, which is a pretty massive leap from that £5 annual rent, right? By July 1891, it's officially open to the public as a museum.
And today, that legacy is absolutely thriving. The Wordsworth Trust has meticulously maintained it, even restoring the garden back to that specific wild look the Wordsworths loved so much. Because of that effort, 70,000 visitors now travel to this Grade 1 listed building every single year to step back in time. The most amazing part is that the cottage itself remains largely unchanged from the days when William and Dorothy sat around that coal fire.
It's honestly incredible to think about the journey of this one building. From serving pints to weary 17th century travelers, to incubating verses that redefined world poetry, to weathering the opium dreams of de Quincey, and finally standing as a time capsule for tens of thousands of us today. It really makes you look differently at the unassuming buildings around your own neighborhood. So I'll leave you with this final thought. What small, everyday places in your own life might be secretly harboring greatness? Thanks so much for exploring the brilliant biography of Dove Cottage with me today.